Okay, so today we are taking a deep dive into Leviticus. Um, I've always been a little intimidated by Leviticus. It's one of those books in the Bible that just seems so dense and, well, to be honest, a little bit boring.
Yeah, I can see why you might think that. It's definitely got a reputation for being all about rules and restrictions and, maybe not the most exciting read.
Right, exactly. Like, I always thought it was just a never-ending list of thou shalt nots.
Well, it's true that there are a lot of laws and commandments in Leviticus, but honestly, there's so much more to it than that. It's really a fascinating window into the world of the ancient Israelites, their rituals, their beliefs, their whole understanding of holiness and purity.
So there's more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. Think of it like a cultural and spiritual deep dive into a world that's both ancient and surprisingly relevant to our lives today.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. So
Yeah.
where do we even begin? I mean, there's so much packed into this book.
Right, there is. Well, why don't we start with something that often trips people up? All those different offerings. You've got burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings. It's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, it really is. And what's with all the specifics about the animals, the preparation, even how the blood is sprinkled? It can seem so, well, complicated.
I know, right? But trust me, every detail has a purpose. These offerings weren't just empty rituals. They were deeply symbolic acts expressing profound theological concepts.
Okay, so break it down for me. What's the significance of, say, a burnt offering?
Okay, so picture this. The entire animal is consumed by fire on the altar. It's a powerful image, right? It represents total surrender and dedication to God.
So it's like saying, here I am, God, all of me, take it.
Exactly. It's an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty and a way of seeking atonement for sin.
So it's not just about going through the motions, it's about the meaning behind the actions.
You got it. The outward act was meant to mirror an inward transformation, a turning towards God.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
So even those seemingly small details were packed with meaning.
absolutely. Remember those instructions for removing a bird's entrails during an offering? Specifically that part about cutting off the tail feathers.
Yeah. I always thought that was a little strange. Like, why the tail feathers?
Well, you can think of it this way. They are physically removing the hindmost part of the bird. It could be seen as symbolically casting off impurities, leaving them behind.
Oh, I see. Like a symbolic purging.
Precisely. It's a beautiful image of the inner purification the Israelites were seeking.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. So Leviticus is all about aligning outward actions with inner transformation.
Exactly. And this focus on symbolism, on the connection between the physical and the spiritual, it's everywhere in Leviticus, particularly when it comes to the priesthood.
You mean those elaborate priestly garments? The tunic, the sash, the robe, all that. It does seem a bit excessive, like they were going to a red carpet event instead of performing a ritual.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But remember, clothing in ancient Israel wasn't just about fashion. It was about expressing identity and status. And those priestly garments were designed to visually set the priests apart.
So like a uniform that signified their special role?
Right. They were intermediaries between God and the people, and their clothing highlighted the sacredness of their role.
It's like their garments were a visual representation of their spiritual authority.
Exactly. And the ordination ceremony itself, described in Leviticus chapter 8, really emphasized this transformation into a sacred role.
Oh, yeah. What's up with that detail about Moses putting the tunic on Aaron before anything else? I mean, why start with the tunic? Seems kind of random.
Right, but it's not random at all. That seemingly simple act actually signifies the very beginning of Aaron's transformation into the high priest. You could say the tunic, the innermost garment, represents the foundation of his priestly identity.
So, like, the very core of his being is being consecrated to God.
Precisely. And, this concept of holiness, of being set apart for God, it extends beyond the priesthood and into everyday life. It's about making even the mundane aspects of life sacred.
So you're talking about the purity laws, right? Those laws about clean and unclean animals, bodily discharges, skin diseases.
Yep, those are the ones. I know they can seem a bit strange to a modern audience.
That's how I was putting it mildly.
Yeah.
They can be downright baffling, to be honest. Like, all those rules about what you can and can't eat, it just seems so arbitrary.
I know, right? It can be tough to wrap our heads around it from our modern perspective. But remember, we're looking into a world that's vastly different from our own. For the Israelites, these laws were all about maintaining ritual purity, which was essential for approaching God.
Okay, so what does ritual purity actually mean? How do they understand that concept, and how does it connect to this bigger idea of holiness?
Well, the Israelites believed that God's presence was holy, pure, and completely set apart. So to approach God, they had to be in a state of ritual purity as well.
So it's like a spiritual cleansing.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It's about aligning themselves with God's holiness, creating a separation between the sacred and the profane.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. So these purity laws were a way of maintaining that separation, of honoring God's holiness.
Right, exactly. It was about creating a space where God's presence could dwell among them, a community set apart, dedicated to living in accordance with his laws.
So it's like a blueprint for a holy society, a society where God is at the center.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about individual piety. These laws, these ideas about purity, they had social implications as well. They impacted everything from what they ate to how they interacted with each other.
Wow. So we're really talking about the very fabric of their community, right? Their whole way of life was shaped by these beliefs.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how these ancient practices reflect their worldview. They didn't see the spiritual and physical realms as separate. They were intertwined, connected in a really profound way.
That's a really interesting point. It's so different from how we tend to view things today.
Right. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? About how our own worldview shapes our understanding of the world, our relationship with God, and even ourselves.
It really does. And that's something I think we should all think about more deeply. But I think we're going to need to take a break here, and we'll pick up this fascinating conversation about Leviticus in part 2 of this deep dive. So stay tuned.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're back, and we're diving even deeper into Leviticus. Before the break, we were talking about ritual purity and those laws that seem so strange to our modern sensibilities.
Yeah, those purity laws, they're definitely a head scratcher for a lot of people today.
No kidding. Like we were talking about clean and unclean animals. I still don't quite get the rationale behind those distinctions.
I hear you. It's one of those things that scholars have debated for centuries, but there are a few theories that might shed some light on it.
Oh, really? Lay it on me.
Okay, well, one theory suggests that it has to do with the animals' habitats. So animals that lived in places considered unclean, like, say, sewage or carcasses, those animals were considered unclean themselves.
So it's like guilt by association. Their environment is unclean, therefore they are too.
Kind of, yeah. It's a symbolic association for sure. Like if their surroundings are considered impure, then that impurity kind of rubs off on them.
Interesting. So what other theories are out there?
Well, some scholars think it might have to do with the animal's behavior, like animals that swarmed or scavenged. Those actions were associated with chaos or impurity, which, was something the Israelites were trying to avoid.
Ah, I see. So it's not just random. There's a worldview behind these classifications, even if you don't fully understand them today.
Exactly. And while we might not follow these specific dietary laws today, they do raise some interesting questions about our own relationship with the natural world.
That's a good point. It makes you think about how our own cultural context shapes our ideas about what's clean and what's not.
Right. It's all relative, isn't it?
Totally. Okay, so let's move on to another tricky topic. Those regulations about bodily discharges. I'll be honest, those chapters are a bit, cuff to stomach.
Yeah, I get it. It's not exactly dinner table conversation.
Yeah.
But if we can push past the initial ew factor, those laws actually reveal a lot about how the Israelites view the human body.
So it wasn't just about hygiene for them.
Not at all. For the Israelites, the body was incredibly potent. Anything having to do with the body life, death, bodily functions, it was all considered spiritually significant.
Really? So how did those beliefs play out in these purity laws?
Well, they believed that bodily discharges in particular were associated with a loss of life force, with impurity, and that required specific rituals to restore a state of holiness.
So like a spiritual reset button.
Yeah, you could say that. It was about restoring balance, reestablishing a right relationship with God and with the community.
And these rituals weren't meant to be punishments.
Right. Right. It's not about shame or guilt. It's about recognizing the spiritual dimension of these bodily experiences and having a way to deal with them in a sacred way.
It's fascinating how everything was connected for them, the physical and the spiritual.
I know. It's so different from how we tend to compartmentalize things today.
It really is.
What?
Okay, so speaking of the body and its connection to the spiritual, what about those chapters about skin diseases?
Ah, yes. Those are pretty intense.
They are. And to be honest, a little confusing. So how did the Israelites understand skin diseases? Were they just medical conditions, or is there something more to it?
That's a great question. And the answer is it was both. They certainly recognized the physical reality of skin diseases, but they also saw them as signs of spiritual impurity. as something that could disrupt the community's relationship with God.
So like a physical manifestation of a spiritual issue.
In a sense, yeah. And the priests played a key role in diagnosing and addressing these issues.
So they were like the doctors of the time.
Yeah, kind of. But they were also spiritual authorities. They would examine the afflicted person, determine the nature of the disease, and then prescribe the appropriate rituals for purification.
It's interesting how they didn't separate those roles, the spiritual and the medical.
Exactly. And those rituals, they weren't just about physical healing. It was about restoring the person to a right relationship with God and with the community.
So it was about more than just the individual. It was about the well-being of the whole group.
Absolutely. These laws, even the ones that seem most foreign to us, were ultimately about creating a society where everyone could live in harmony, both with God and with each other.
Wow. It's like a whole different way of thinking about community and responsibility.
Right. It's a reminder that for them, everything was connected. The spiritual and the physical, the individual and the community. It was all part of one big interconnected web.
It's a powerful image, that's for sure. And it makes you think about our own interconnectedness, even today.
Yeah, for sure. We may not follow these specific purity laws in our modern world, but they do make us think about our own relationship with our bodies, with each other, and with the divine.
It's a good reminder that even those ancient practices can still speak to us today, even if it's in a different way. But you know what? We're going to have to take another break here. We'll be back with the final part of our deep dive into Leviticus after a quick break. Don't go away.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Leviticus. And, I have to say, this book is full of surprises. It's so much more than just a list of rules and regulations.
I know, right? It's really challenged my own assumptions about Leviticus.
Mine too. But before we get too sentimental, there's one more area I want to touch on, and that's those forbidden practices listed in Leviticus.
Yes. Those are always a hot topic.
You're not kidding. And I think it's important that we address them. We talked briefly about child sacrifice earlier, but Leviticus chapter 18 has a whole section on prohibited sexual relationships. It's pretty explicit. It is, and it can be uncomfortable to read, for sure. But it's there, and I think it's important to try to understand why these acts were so strictly prohibited in ancient Israel.
Okay, so walk me through it. What's the context for these prohibitions?
Well, we have to remember that for the Israelites, their relationship with God was everything. It was a covenant relationship, a sacred bond. And these forbidden acts, they were seen as violations of that sacred order, as threats to the integrity of the community and their relationship with God.
So it's connected to that idea of holiness we've been talking about all along, that separation between the sacred and the profane.
Exactly. These acts were seen as blurring those lines, as bringing impurity into the community, and ultimately as jeopardizing their relationship with God.
But why were they so concerned with sexual purity in particular? I mean, it seems like a pretty specific focus.
Well, it's important to remember that in ancient societies, sexuality was often closely tied to religious beliefs and practices. Fertility cults were common, and there were all sorts of rituals and practices associated with sexuality.
Oh, right. Like those pagan rituals they were always trying to avoid.
Exactly. So by prohibiting these specific acts, the Israelites were setting themselves apart, rejecting those cultural norms, and forging a different kind of relationship with God.
So it was about defining their own unique identity, rooted in their covenant with God.
Precisely. And that desire to be set apart, to be holy, it's really the driving force behind all of Leviticus.
It's amazing how this one book, often seen as just a list of rules, actually reveals so much about an entire worldview.
I know. It's really changed my own perspective on Leviticus. It's not just about restrictions, it's about a way of life, a guide to creating a society that embodies the principles of justice, compassion, and holiness.
Those are values that are still relevant today, right? Even if we don't follow all the specific laws and rituals.
Absolutely. I think Leviticus challenges us to think deeply about our own values. What truly matters in life? How do we live in right relationship with God, with each other, and with the world around us?
It's a powerful message, that's for sure. And it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. One of the things that struck me most about Leviticus is how it emphasizes the interconnectedness of everything. The spiritual and the physical, the individual and the community.
Right. It's all part of one big, beautiful tapestry.
Exactly. And I think that's a message we need to hear today, maybe now more than ever. We live in a world that's so fragmented, so disconnected. But Leviticus reminds us that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves.
And that our actions have ripple effects, both for good and for bad.
Exactly. It's a call to responsibility, to live lives of intention and purpose, knowing that our choices impact not just ourselves, but the whole community.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Leviticus, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from it?
That's a great question. I think I would say this. Don't be afraid to dive deep into these ancient texts, even the ones that seem challenging, or maybe even a little off-putting at first glance, because you never know what treasures you might find.
That's great advice. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey through Leviticus. It's been a real eye-opener for me, and I hope it has been for you too.
It was my pleasure. Always a joy to explore these ancient texts.
And we hope you'll join us again next time for another deep dive into the Scriptures. Until then, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.